Barcelona was a city of light and life, its streets filled with laughter, music, and the hum of a bustling metropolis. But in the shadowy alleys of the Barri Gothic, life took on a different rhythm, one of whispers, secrets, and superstition. It was there, amidst the winding streets and ancient stonework, that the first whispers began. The Perez family had been respected members of the community. Carlos Perez, a retired historian, was known for his work preserving the city's history. When their lifeless bodies were found in their apartment, twisted in terror, the city was gripped with unease. There were no signs of forced entry, no physical harm. The cause of death, heart attacks. But the looks on their faces, eyes wide, mouths agape, told another story. By the time the fourth family was found dead in similar circumstances, the police were at a loss. That's when I got the call. Detective Elric Graves, the voice on the other end said, low and urgent. We need your expertise in Barcelona. Something unexplainable is happening here. I had dealt with banshees before, spirits whose wails foretold death, but they were part of Irish lore, not Spanish. Still, I packed my bag. If Barcelona had become a hunting ground for such a creature, I needed to find out why. The air in Barcelona was unusually cold for spring, a biting wind snaking through the labyrinth of streets. The police chief, Inspector Esteban Ruiz, met me at the latest crime scene in the Unravel district. His face was drawn, his hands clenched tightly around his radio. This is the fifth family, he said, leading me into the building. The Garcias. Parents and 3 children, all found dead in their living room. The apartment was stiflingly silent. The bodies had already been removed, but the sense of dread lingered like a fog. On the wall, claw marks ran deep into the plaster, jagged and wild. A faint melody seemed to hang in the air, barely audible, a woman's voice, ethereal and mournful. You hear that? I asked Ruiz. He frowned, his expression uneasy. Hear what? I followed the sound to the window. It was open, the curtains fluttering in the wind. Below, the city seemed oblivious, its lights twinkling against the night sky. But the song, it was real, and it wasn't coming from any human throat. Ruiz took me to meet the only known survivor, a woman named Lucia Morales. She lived 2 blocks from the Garcias and had heard the wailing the night they died. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she recounted her story. It started around midnight, she said. I was about to go to bed when I heard her. A voice, so beautiful but so wrong. It was like it was coming from inside my head. And what did you see? I asked. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the window as if the memory might manifest. A woman. Pale, almost glowing. She was standing in the alley, looking up at the Garcia's window. Her hair was wild, and her eyes, they were black. Like a void. Did she speak to you? Ruiz asked. Lucia shook her head. No. She just screamed. The kind of scream that makes your soul want to crawl out of your body. The banshee was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. Lucia's description matched the legends, a banshee, a harbinger of death. But why here? Why Barcelona? I spent the evening poring over police reports, looking for patterns. Each family had lived within a 3-kilometer radius, all in historic parts of the city. Their deaths followed the same pattern, no signs of entry, no physical wounds, just terror-induced cardiac arrest. And always, witnesses reported hearing the song before the screams. Ruiz knocked on the door of my temporary office, his face grim. We found something new. You should see this. He handed me a photo taken from the Garcia's apartment. On the wall above the claw marks, words had been scrawled in what looked like blood, Ella canta para los muertos. She sings for the dead. Barcelona had its fair share of ghost stories, but I needed to know if any local legends mentioned a banshee-like figure. I visited the Museu de Historia de Barcelona, where I met with an archivist named Miguel Alvarez. He was a stooped, elderly man with sharp eyes and a vast knowledge of the city's past. "A banshee, you say?" he asked, flipping through a dusty tome. "Not common here, but there is one tale that might interest you." He recounted the story of La Llorona de Barcelona, a mournful spirit said to haunt the city's oldest streets. According to legend, she had been a mother who lost her children to plague in the 17th century. Consumed by grief, she wandered the city wailing for them until her death. Some claimed she had cursed the city to hear her cries whenever tragedy loomed. "This doesn't sound like a typical banshee," I said. "Why would she be active now?" Miguel shrugged. "Perhaps someone disturbed her. Or perhaps she never left." Miguel mentioned a specific location tied to La Llorona's legend, a crumbling wall in the Barri Gothic known as the Wailing Wall. It was said that her cries could be heard there on certain nights, especially during times of unrest. Ruiz and I visited the wall that evening. It was an unassuming structure, tucked between two narrow streets. Graffiti and moss covered its surface, but as the wind picked up, I felt it, the unmistakable chill of spectral energy. "She's been here," I said, running my hand along the wall. A faint vibration hummed beneath my fingers, like the remnants of a scream. "What are we dealing with?" Ruiz asked, his voice low. "Not just a banshee," I replied. "Something older. Something tied to this city's history." The banshee's cries returned the very next night, and with them, another tragedy. The Martinez family, living just 3 streets away from the Wailing Wall, was found dead. 6 members, from grandparents to a newborn, all in the same room, their faces frozen in expressions of unbearable terror. Inspector Ruiz and I arrived on the scene as the first responders were leaving. The air inside the Martinez home was heavy, oppressive, and cold enough to see our breath. Ruiz pulled his coat tighter and muttered, "It's worse this time." Indeed, the walls were covered in fresh claw marks, deeper and more erratic than before. But what caught my attention was the mirror above the fireplace. It had shattered, the shards embedded in the walls and furniture. At its center, one word had been written in condensation, as if by a ghostly hand, "Escúchame." "Listen to me," I translated. The banshee wasn't just a harbinger of death. She was trying to communicate. Back at the precinct, I combed through the Martinez family's history. There was nothing remarkable, no recent feuds, no enemies, no ties to the previous victims. Yet the pattern of deaths grew more erratic, as if the banshee's rage was escalating. Ruiz brought me a fresh report. "Lucia Morales, the witness you spoke to. She's gone." "Gone where?" I asked sharply. He shook his head. "No one knows. Her apartment was found empty. No signs of struggle, but neighbors reported hearing her screaming the night before. The banshee was escalating, and now she was taking people." I pored over the word in the mirror, "Escúchame." What was she trying to say? If she wanted to kill indiscriminately, she could have done so already. But this was specific, deliberate. I needed to find out who she was and why she was targeting these families. Miguel Alvarez called me back to the museum. "I found something," he said, spreading a yellowed map across his desk. It depicted Barcelona as it had been in the 1600s. Miguel pointed to a shaded area marked Fos dels Oblidats, the grave of the forgotten. "This was a mass burial site during the plague," Miguel explained. "Hundreds of bodies were dumped here, unmarked, unblessed. It's now part of Placa Sant Jaume, right in the heart of the city." Ruiz and I visited the square that evening. The bustling plaza was alive with tourists and street performers, oblivious to the city's dark past beneath their feet. But as the night deepened, the energy shifted. The air grew colder, and the sounds of laughter and music faded. Then, we heard it, the banshee's wail. The cry was deafening, a piercing lament that reverberated through the square. Tourists and locals alike froze, clutching their ears, some collapsing to their knees in pain. Ruiz grabbed my arm, his face pale. Where is she? I scanned the square, and there she was, a spectral figure hovering just above the cobblestones, her translucent form shimmering in the moonlight. Her face was gaunt, her hair wild, and her eyes black as voids. She let out another wail, and the ground beneath us shook. I stepped forward, pulling a silver talisman from my coat. Why are you here? I demanded, my voice cutting through the chaos. What do you want? For a moment, the banshee paused. Her gaze fixed on me, and her voice became a whisper, just loud enough to hear. The forgotten must be remembered. The banshee vanished into the night, leaving the plaza in stunned silence. Emergency responders arrived to treat those affected by the wail, but Ruiz and I had a clearer picture now. This wasn't just a curse. It was a demand for justice. Miguel's research confirmed that the families targeted by the banshee had distant ties to Barcelona's history during the plague. Some were descendants of the city's wealthiest merchants, who had survived the outbreak by exploiting the poor. Others were connected to the priests and officials who had condemned thousands to the Foss dels Obladats without proper burial rites. She's targeting the bloodlines of those she blames, Miguel concluded grimly. But why now? What had stirred her from centuries of silence? Ruiz received a call from a construction company working in Placa Sant Jaume. They had unearthed a mass grave while digging the foundation for a new development. Bones, hundreds of them, tangled and broken, buried beneath layers of earth. When we arrived, the workers were visibly shaken. We didn't know what we were digging into, one said, his voice trembling. But the moment we hit the bones, things started happening. Tools breaking, lights flickering. And that scream, it wasn't human. The banshee had been awakened by the disturbance of the Foss dels Obladats. She wasn't just a spirit of vengeance, she was a guardian of the forgotten dead. And now, she demanded retribution. Miguel and I devised a plan to appease the banshee. According to local legends, spirits of unrest could be calmed through a ritual of remembrance, an offering of light, prayer, and acknowledgement of their pain. The challenge was performing the ritual in a city that was terrified and on edge. With Ruiz's help, we secured permission to conduct the ceremony in Placa Sant Jaume. Candles would be lit, prayers spoken, and the bones given a proper blessing. But there was a risk. If the banshee deemed our efforts insufficient, her wrath could escalate beyond anything we'd seen. The night of the ritual arrived. The plaza was cordoned off, the flicker of hundreds of candles casting an eerie glow on the ancient stones. A small crowd gathered, descendants of the families, priests, and historians, all hoping to end the banshee's curse. As I began the prayers, the air grew cold, and a low wail echoed through the square. The banshee appeared once more, her form more solid than ever before. She hovered above the bones, her gaze piercing. "This is your final chance," I said, holding the talisman high. "We remember you. We honor you. Let this be enough." The banshee let out one final scream, and the ground beneath us trembled. The banshee's scream shook the plaza, extinguishing several of the candles. The temperature dropped sharply, and frost crept across the cobblestones. The crowd stood frozen, their faces pale with terror. Some fell to their knees, whispering prayers. Others clung to each other, unable to look at the spectral figure looming above. The banshee's form flickered, her voice shifting between a mournful wail and incomprehensible whispers. It was as if she was speaking, but her words were lost in the echoes of time. Miguel, standing close to me, whispered urgently, "We need to show her we mean it. She doesn't trust us." I stepped forward, holding the silver talisman high. "We disturbed your rest," I said, my voice steady despite the chill that cut to my bones. "But we are here to make amends. Your pain will not be forgotten." The banshee's eyes locked on me. Black and bottomless, they seemed to peer into my very soul. Then, slowly, she extended a hand, pointing to the mass grave. A sound like 1,000 mournful voices rose from the earth, and the frost cracked underfoot. The ground beneath the plaza trembled, and faint, spectral figures began to rise. They were translucent, barely more than shadows, but their anguish was palpable. These were the forgotten souls of the Fos dels Obladats, the victims of plague and neglect. Their hollow eyes turned toward the banshee, then toward the crowd. The banshee let out another wail, and the figures raised their arms, pointing accusingly at the gathered descendants. A young woman in the crowd screamed, clutching her chest as if she could feel the weight of their judgment. "This is why they suffer," Miguel whispered. "They want recognition, not just words." I turned to Ruiz. "We need to name them. Each of them." Ruiz blinked. "We don't even know who they are." "Then we start with what we do know," I said. "We honor their existence." The ceremony continued, now more solemn than ever. The priests and historians began reciting names, any they could find from the records of the plague era. Each name spoken seemed to dim the banshee's fury, her form flickering with less intensity. One of the historians, an elderly man with a shaky voice, stepped forward and began reading from a parchment he had brought. The names were few, incomplete, but they were a start. Each syllable echoed across the plaza, carrying with it the weight of centuries. The banshee watched, her head tilting as if listening. The spectral figures grew calmer, their accusatory gestures softening into something almost reverent. The frost on the ground began to recede. But the air still buzzed with tension. The banshee wasn't finished. As the last name was read, the banshee let out a sharp, piercing cry. The ground trembled again, and her form grew darker, her features twisting in anguish. "She's not satisfied," Miguel said. "There's one she wants us to name, but we don't know who." The banshee turned her gaze back to me, her hollow eyes filled with something that might have been desperation. Slowly, she raised a hand and pointed to one of the candles near the mass grave. The flame flickered violently before extinguishing. I approached the spot, heart pounding. Beneath the extinguished candle lay a fragment of bone, a single, delicate piece. It was small, too small to belong to an adult. My breath caught. "A child," I said softly. The realization spread through the crowd like wildfire. The banshee had not only been mourning the forgotten but someone personal, someone close to her in life. A child buried among the masses, her name and story erased by time. Miguel's eyes widened as he pieced it together. "She lost her children during the plague," he murmured. "That's what made her what she is. And this child must have been hers." The banshee wailed again, a sound of unbearable sorrow that seemed to split the night. The spectral figures turned toward the grave, their forms bowing as if in acknowledgement. "We need to give her child a name," I said. "Something to mark her existence, to let her rest." Miguel, Ruiz, and I knelt by the grave, discussing the best way to proceed. The parchment contained no records of children buried in the Fos dels Obladats. If the child had been swept into the pit, her identity was lost. But that didn't mean we couldn't give her something to hold on to in death. Ruiz, his voice rough but steady, began reciting a prayer for the unnamed. Miguel added a few lines in Catalan, a language that might feel familiar to the lost soul. I placed my hand over the bone fragment and whispered, "Maria. We name you Maria." The banshee froze. The frost receded entirely. And for the first time, her form seemed to soften. Her hollow eyes blinked, and her mournful expression shifted to something, almost peaceful. The crowd sighed in relief as the banshee's form began to fade. The spectral figures around her bowed low, their forms dissipating like mist in the wind. But just as the banshee seemed ready to leave, the air turned heavy once more. The claw marks on the ground glowed faintly, and the banshee's voice echoed in the plaza, "One remains." "What does she mean?" Miguel asked, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, the plaza darkened. The banshee pointed to the crowd, and the temperature dropped again. She was searching for something, or someone. The banshee's gaze locked on a man near the back of the crowd. He froze, his face pale as death. "No," he whispered, backing away. "No, please." Miguel's face twisted in realization. He's a descendant of one of the officials who buried her child. The man fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. I didn't, please, forgive me." The banshee hovered over him, her form darkening once more. This wasn't just a demand for remembrance, it was justice. I stepped forward, holding up the talisman. "This man is not the one who wronged you," I said firmly. "He carries their blood, but not their sins. Let him live, and I swear we will honor your memory and your child's." The banshee hesitated, her form flickering. Her gaze shifted between me and the man. Slowly, her wailing softened, becoming a whisper. She pointed to the ground near the mass grave. "She wants a promise," Miguel said. "A memorial." The crowd sprang into action, gathering stones to create a makeshift memorial. Flowers were laid, candles relit, and prayers spoken in both Catalan and Latin. The man knelt at the center, offering his own apologies and blessings. The banshee's form began to fade, her dark features softening into the pale, sorrowful woman she must have once been. She bowed her head to the memorial, her voice echoing one final time, "Remember us." By dawn, the banshee was gone. The frost had melted, and the oppressive chill lifted from the city. The memorial remained, a quiet reminder of Barcelona's forgotten souls. Inspector Ruiz, Miguel, and I stood in silence, watching the sun rise over Placa Sant Jaume. "Do you think she'll ever return?" Ruiz asked. "Not as long as we keep our promise," I said. And with that, the city of Barcelona, alive with history and pain, was finally at peace. For now.